I don't think the Russians are being bamboozled. The problem for them is that they don't want World War III like any rational person wouldn't. They could take a much harder line than they have, but they're trying to find a way to deal with the situation, to diffuse the crazy war-mongering attitudes that they're coming across when they're dealing with Western interlocutors. But the way they're doing it is the very sensible way, which is not to confront them directly, just to leave them in a position where they can't really do what they want because they just can't.
Anyway, we're going to hear now from former US naval intelligence asset Kenyon Gibson now. He was also infiltrating drug gangs, I believe, in New York as well. And one of the things that he did almost in his spare time when he was living over here in the UK was to infiltrate fascist groups in London. But he did the same sort of thing when he was over in the United States recently, speaking to a guy called Michael Bagley. So anyway, let's hear it from Kenyon Gibson now. He's trying to look at these fascist groups and how they're completely connected with war and making money from war.
Michael Bagley. Bagley is head of a company called Jellyfish, and he used to work for Operations Intelligence. He was recruited by Jellyfish. He was sent to Syria, and I met him at Penn Station. I spoke to him undercover, acting as if I was a member of an international group of Nazis and terrorist supporters. He knew somebody in London named Jonathan Boulter, who is a serious Satanist and sadist and into all these groups. Boulter sent me an email saying that Syria was to become a mini Halliburton, and Bagley had the keys to Syria. Bagley represents one of the three branches of U.S. intelligence, and that's private intelligence, the other two being military intelligence and government intelligence, which is CIA, DIA, NSA, Homeland Security, etc. So private intel companies being used to do what they want, with the American government able to deny what's going on, but also these private intel agencies, as Bagley told me, he basically laughed at the notion that he was doing this for Americans. He's never been a serviceman. He told me flat out he was doing it for the money. And Trump comes to power in January of this year, and he doesn't know what's going on. The private intel companies just hope to create their mini Halliburton, make a lot of money like they've done elsewhere around the world and in Vietnam, as I just mentioned. So Trump sees a mess, and one day something bad happens, and his daughter comes to him and says, "Daddy, kids are being killed." And Trump puts a stop to it in a very humanitarian way. I have to give him credit. He called and said, "Look, we're going to bomb you, so why don't you get out of the way, but we want to get rid of these chemical weapons." So no civilians were killed. There was no loss of American soldiers either. He did as the commander-in-chief ought to have done. He got some criticism. He got support. But he was not acting out of a desire to hurt Russia, hurt Syria, or hurt anyone. And that's very important. Unfortunately, though, with secret actors like Michael Bagley and Jellyfish, a.k.a. Blackwater, as it used to be called, but it changes its name, maybe because it's ashamed of its past activities, in there, nobody really knows what's going on. So Russia and America are brought to friction over the actions of people like Michael Bagley, just as America and Vietnam were brought to war because people like whoever the forces were that killed John F. Kennedy wanted the war for their own profit.
Well, that's interesting. I'm afraid I don't agree that Trump acted well there. Trump shouldn't have carried out the cruise missile attacks. He killed 5 children, as far as we know.
More to the point, I mean, we're looking here at whether Syria is really nothing to do with whether chemical weapons are or aren't being used. It's all about Blackwater mercenaries and Halliburton. Well,
yes, I mean, that's pretty obvious, isn't it, to anybody who looks into this. The military-industrial complex has got its own interests. It likes wars because wars are where it makes its money.
And I guess what Kenyon is saying there is that because Trump is a property developer, it's quite easy to bamboozle him in situations like this.
He's not really competent to be running a show like that, is he?
Well, he's kind of pushing out most of his foreign policy to the generals.
Well, that's right. So, in other words, Trump's basically a chump. And he's easily bamboozled. He made the decision. Of course, with the way he managed it is he told the Russians, "Yes, we're going to carry out this strike, but we're going to give you warning." And of course, therefore, no Russians were killed. But I'm afraid some children were killed nearby, 5 at least. And of course, it was supposedly because Ivanka got really upset about the children who died. And of course, the other thing about the original chemical weapons attack is it's quite likely that the rebels who we arm and train, they carried it out and killed those people. And therefore, we should be attacking them. And in case we're going to attack them, we might as well attack ourselves.
What's the state of play with this chemical weapons attack? What do you think now? Who was behind it? What happened?
Well, the evidence that there's various theories floating around that there was some kind of chemicals released during an air attack on the.
Because I understand Seymour Hersh has weighed in on this one.
Yeah, well, but Seymour Hersh has said what Seymour Hersh has got is he's getting the inside gen from people in the military. That's what makes his stuff so good. But of course, they've also got an interest in selling a certain line. Yeah, so we get inside information, but it's quite possible that he's only getting half the truth. The Russians have looked at the videos, and they're pretty much convinced that the videos are fakes, that there is nothing happening here other than people pretending that something's happening. So, for example, the whole idea that was sarin used is completely ridiculous because the people in the videos have got no protective clothing on.
It's potentially a dramatising a situation like this. Quite a powerful way, isn't it, of drumming up a market for people like Blackwater Jellyfish?
Well, of course it is. And of course the whole thing about children are being killed by these evil people, that's a way to get people who aren't really paying attention emotionally engaged, so that we can then go. I mean, of course, and it worked for Trump. He carried out the cruise missile attacks, the Tomahawk tweet, and then his opinion polls rating 60% of the US approved of what he'd done. That's because people are being bamboozled. They're being bamboozled by their own intelligence services. Intelligence services, as we've just discussed, learnt most of their techniques from the Nazis, who were integrated into those intelligence services when NATO was set up. Incidentally, I was reading this week Oliver Stone's interview with Putin, and Putin said, we've got overwhelming evidence that the snipers in the Maidan Square that killed the Holy 100 in the coup in Ukraine were trained by NATO special forces. So, in other words, not only are the Russians and the Syrians not engaged in these evil acts, we are carrying out those evil acts. And that means, if you're not a pacifist, Tony, that some top US, British and other generals either go to prison or get their brains blown out.
Well, another development this week, Jewish Voice UK has launched a social media campaign to fight Tommy Robinson and the far right. And I'm just going to read their statement out now, or parts of it anyway. Tommy Robinson has on a number of occasions attempted to co-opt the Jewish community to further his abhorrent Islamaphobic rhetoric, presumably in an attempt to gain legitimacy off the back of the legitimate fears regarding rising anti-Semitism. They say now, let us be very clear, Tommy Robinson is not a friend of the Jews. He is a pernicious man, a purveyor of division and othering. Vision of the diverse Jewish community are in direct conflict with those things. Islamophobia is considered a new phenomenon by most, but it isn't. It's the foreign threat that racist elements in our society have been peddling for centuries. Now, this goes on, and I'll put a link to it on our show page. But, Martin, it's interesting to see Tommy Robinson saying, well, I'm sticking up for the Jews against Islam, but actually Jewish Voice UK, a Jewish media group, both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, is saying, we want nothing to do with you, Tommy.
Well, I've never heard of the group before, but obviously I agree with what they're saying there. And it's very welcome that they've spoken out.
And also, when I spoke to Kenyon Gibson earlier this week, I spoke to him also about fascist groups in the UK, far-right and fascist groups in the UK. And he's talking here about fascist incubators. He's talking about the people behind Britain First and something called the New Left. And he also mentions again Michael Bagley in the United States. So here's former US Naval Intelligence agent Kenyon Gibson, who also worked infiltrating drug gangs in New York.
There was a range of groups, from small groups that had very few members, and the fewer members, the more outrageous they were. So there's a guy, Kevin Quinn. Kevin Quinn was probably the most outrageous because he openly claimed that he believed in Nazism and read Mein Kampf. He had the least members, and he changed the name of his group from the November 9th Society to the British First Party. Then there was the British People's Party, which was very small. The British National Party, which was the biggest, but shied away from out-and-out Nazism. They had a lot of problems after they were infiltrated by a Guardian reporter in about 2008. And I got into a lesser-known group that has the most power of them all called New Right. New Right had meetings of about 60 people once a month in London at a secret location. You'd come to a location, and then everybody would get a secret text telling you that wasn't the location, and Jonathan Boulter would show up and lead you to a pub. There'd be 4 speakers. I was a speaker on a couple of occasions, but mainly the speakers were all anti-Semitic. You had a range of people who were also anti-Muslim to Muslim-speaking who hated Jews. But anti-Semitism was a common denominator there. And there was a lot of networking going on. So some people in that group were just right-wing activists who had no clue, and they paid their £5 to sit in this group and have a pint downstairs. And then others were much more powerful, like Jonathan Boulter, who personally knew Adrian Davies QC, who knew the late Jonathan Bowden, who knew Darius Guppy, the man who punched out Princess Diana's brother. And so the more powerful elite in these groups went around the world and had contacts with people like Michael Bagley. They are rather silly groups. So let me explain. You're a taxpayer, and these funds that you give to the government every year get partially allocated to intelligence agencies, and in the U.S. private intelligence agencies, and these private intelligence agencies then turn around and use this money to create problems and wars and make money for themselves and their affiliates.
Well, that's a pretty good summary of what goes on. And the private intelligence agencies are pernicious. What's happened with the CIA, it's become a huge subcontracting exercise these days. But underlying all of this, there are even bigger fish who are playing geopolitical games on an even bigger level.
It sounds from what Ken is saying. I mean, it's quite plucky of him, I suppose, to infiltrate these groups and even to get to speak on the same platform as serious anti-Semites in order to sort of keep his cover going. But effectively, we are in a situation where the far right does seem completely immune to any kind of arrests and prosecutions when it comes to actually fomenting Islamophobia.
Listen, what we believe, and we've got quite a lot of evidence to suggest it, is that both extremist Muslims and extremist right-wingers are being encouraged in their bad behaviour and their bad talking in order to create a conflict in society, which then allows the private security industry to make a killing pretending to sort it out. And I think it's not insignificant that both the English Defence League and Al-Majah Haroun, one of the most extreme of the Muslim front organisations, both appeared simultaneously in Luton some years ago. And it's very, very bizarre that they both appear simultaneously, supposedly hate each other's guts, absolute excuse for a punch-up, but they just appear both at the same time, and I don't think that's an accident. I think we've got intelligence agencies and private agencies stirring the pot here. They want to see trouble. Trouble is their business.